In countries that constitute the right to bear arms, this House would mandate compulsory gun ownership and training for all citizens. Prime Minister, please begin the debate.
A gun is not just like a device that shoots bullets. We recognize that in states where the right to bear arms is legal, a gun is an extension of your fundamental rights and principle under any framework and policy, and that's something we're going to defend strictly coming from opening government. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, why ownership of guns is an extension of these fundamental rights, and secondly, why private ownership and training for guns creates a much better country and state. But before that, I'd like to clarify and propose a few things. Firstly, the first clarification is that this debate will take place in a world where exposure to firearms and guns is inevitable regardless of whether or not you own a gun. Because even if you don't own a gun, you're going to see guns being used anywhere else. You're going to see guns in the supermarket. You're going to see guns everywhere around you. You're going to see guns in TV. Guns will be exposed to you. So the question in this debate is, given that exposure is going to happen because of legislation and mandates, where do we best protect people? Our proposal is going to come in 4 ways. First, the government is going to introduce the concept of guns at a very young age. So at primary school, secondary school, you're already going to be shown like this is a gun, this is what you do with a gun, this is what your parents probably have a gun, and they're going to try and expose you to the mechanics of a gun. Obviously, we're not going to let you shoot a gun, but you're going to know what a gun basically is, and you're going to know what a gun is used for. Secondly, the government is going to institutionalize mandatory gun training at the age of 18. Now, this gun training will be classified as well later on, but this gun training is very important to the third prong. Thirdly, a license will be issued after completing this gun training. Clearly, you have to pass the training. If you don't pass the training, you are required to take the training course again after a year. Fourthly, there are exemptions clearly. Like, if you are injured or visually impaired, you don't have to own a gun. If you're mentally unstable, you don't have a gun. And if you've already overused your right to bear arms, or you've used it in a lethal way, you can no longer use a gun as well. So if, like, for instance, you commit a crime with a gun, we are also going to revoke your license to own a gun in the future because of that unlawful use of force. On to my first question. Why is the ownership of guns an extension of your fundamental right? Firstly, the right to life. We think an extension of every single right under your institution is the right that you have to be able to be living and breathing to try and actualize any of these rights. We think in the onset where governments aren't there to protect you all the time, there has to be some sort of institution, especially in a government where the right to bear arms is already legal, for you to protect yourself. Now, the way we're going to revoke this is we're going to understand that guns as a use of protection will always be a last resort. We don't want people to be shooting each other at like first glance. We don't want people to just shoot each other when any form of danger is presented to them. We're always going to use it as a last resort. No thank you. And this is going to be institutionalized in our training seminars. We basically want to push the idea that while a government can protect you, in the event that there is no government protection, no thank you, it is impossible and you are the last line of defense for your protection. Secondly, the idea of our right to a quality life. Given that we're living in a context where the right to bear arms is legal, people are always going to be living all around constant fear. The fear that possibly your neighbor has a handgun, the fear that the guy next to you in the bus is holding a handgun, the fear that anytime you're ever going to leave your house, you could be exposed to a handgun. We think this level of fear is magnified in the context of America when people are afraid to leave their houses at night because they might be exposed to danger and gun violence. We think we want to protect the right of life to people and no longer be always fearful of the idea that they can't do anything or they're always going to be exposed to guns. We think by providing them with any form of gun, firstly, they have protection in the event that they are exposed to guns, but secondly, they know that people have already been institutionalized to protect themselves and that there's a strong deterrence, an active deterrence by the state to make it so that violence does not happen. Second question. Why is the mandatory use of guns going to be good for a country as a whole? But before that, sure.
Can you explain a bit more what do you mean by last resort?
Okay, by last resort, we mean shooting a gun or using your gun will not always be the first option. Your first option might be calling 911, understanding that you might not have to use lethal force. There are situational cases that are going to be taught in that training seminar. That's something the government will take care of. But initially, if you don't have to use a gun, you shouldn't. You only use a gun when you have to, and that's what it means to be a last resort. On to the second question. So why do we think gun ownership and private gun training is going to be beneficial to a country as a whole? Firstly, this idea of a mandate. We already recognize that because the right to bear arms is already institutionalized, it is very important in terms of preserving your important principles, and it is already a constitutional right. We think because it already is a right under these governments, it is fair that these governments give everybody equal access to that given right that was already constitutionalized.
Yeah.
The first example of this is to people who just simply can't afford a gun and who just can't go under the training and can't ever try and buy these handguns. We think it is unfair to them, and because it is a right, they deserve that right. But secondly, we recognize that there are also people that have been always brought up to understand that guns are unacceptable. Whether it's their parents that tell them that you shouldn't use guns, or whether it's society that tells you shouldn't use guns, that is an unfair attack on their character because they're always going to be against using guns and they'll always regard guns as something that is unnecessary. We think given the state already values gun ownership as a right, we think it is fair that we extend this option to them, and that option can only be extended when they're presented with the option by the state and they're not excluded from it. Secondly, the idea of society. We think oftentimes you're always going to be exposed to guns. But the question is, how do we best make it so that this exposure isn't going to impact you negatively? We think it is by understanding that people should not fear guns, but understand guns. And that can only happen when they're always going to be given exposure to these guns and they understand exactly how to use these guns. The example we'd like to launch here is the example of a child in any of these countries. What's going to happen is these children will never fear any sort of handgun and will always understand that safe gun usage is going to be common courtesy, to the point where they've always been brought up to understand that a gun has to be used in proper ways and a gun has to be taken care of in proper ways. We want to make it so that this exposure can trickle down to people and always make them understand that gun ownership isn't about shooting people, but it's about protecting yourself and being safe when you use a gun. And that's how we think exposure is going to happen. Thirdly, this idea of society and safety. We think oftentimes, if you're going to be exposed to guns, we would rather that the government exposes you to guns than anybody else. Why is it so? Firstly, anybody else who exposes you to guns will not have a direct incentive to properly teach you how to use these guns. Like clearly, if your best friend shows you a handgun, he's not going to always tell you how to use this handgun. He's not always going to tell you the situations where it's best to use that handgun. So clearly, if you're going to be exposed, and if you're going to buy a handgun, you need to be exposed properly. Secondly, we think that by being exposed by the government is already trying to send you a clear picture of how guns are supposed to be used and institutionalized. This means that people aren't going to value guns as a first resort, people aren't going to value guns as a tool of violence, but guns are always going to be regarded as a tool that the state has given to you to protect yourself. And that's the only fundamental tool, and you can only get that when the state tries to promote guns as a whole. Ultimately, we think that if you want to promote the right to bear arms, and if you want to institutionalize the rights of people, given that it is already an important mandate, people have to be exposed to guns. Because if they're not exposed to guns, they're going to get guns in situations where they may have not intended to do, and for all those reasons, we are extremely proud to propose. Thanks.
House thanks the Speaker, Opposition Leader.
Generally, Mr. Speaker, we are against the right to bear arms. We are against the Second Amendment. We would prefer strict gun control, or absent that, the closest possible thing that we could get to strict gun control. Because we believe that this is an archaic holdover from a time when police weren't really a thing that you could rely on, that would probably take a day to go out of town to your little shack in the woods, and you probably won't be able to overthrow the state today if you have a large enough rifle repository, because the state has tanks and planes and things. But the particular topic at hand is, what role do guns play in self-defense? And what we're positing on opening opposition is that it is first of all an excuse for a laxer police force, and secondly, it encourages risky behavior. The right to bear arms does this in general, but this in particular is exponentially worsened by the motion at hand. Because this is what the motion does. It makes the gun for self-defense option become more than just an option, it becomes the option.
Shame.
It becomes
Shame.
the option that you are trained to do when you feel that your life is actually under threat. And I'll get to the idea later that it's not going to be your first resort. Because it doesn't have to be your first resort to be something that you eventually resort to
Hear, hear.
anyway. And we still think that just the possibility of that is generally a bad thing. What do we prefer? We prefer that if your life is under threat, that you just cooperate with the criminal, save your life, don't expose yourself to the danger of a gunfight, and you call the police
Hear, hear.
afterwards
Hear, hear.
in the worst
Hear, hear.
case scenarios. Because, like, oftentimes, right, very few people are just out to kill you. They probably want your money, or they want something else from you, and they're trying to commit a crime, and it's when you fight back, which you will be trained and enabled to do on their side, that they actually try hurting you. So before I get on to my constructive about how you encourage risky behavior, and I'll explain that on 2 levels, let me get to my rebuttals, right? First of all, let's deal with this idea, right? That they're creating, that it's an extension of your vital rights and all of these kinds of things. Yet at the same time in his proposal, he tells us that your right to bear arms is a revocable right that can be taken away if you do unlawful behavior, for example, right? The question there then becomes, then how is it so fundamental? And the answer to this question, because I'm not just going to launch a rhetorical question, is because you don't lose the right to life when you lose the gun. You don't lose the quality of your life
Hear, hear.
when you lose the gun. Gunless people in America do walk around at night, contrary to what Bart would have you believe,
Sir.
and this speaks
Sir.
to the false problem which they're basing their entire case on. You're not under constant threat and constant exposure to people that have guns. There are people in society that have guns, yes, but we don't think that you're always that they're literally everywhere and that you're literally in danger of being shot at any given time. I'll take you after my rebuttals, right? But moreover, he tells us that, well, now, and this is very patronizing right here. People who don't want guns will now be liberated from the fact that they do not have guns. They are no longer excluded from the right to gun ownership. Beyond being very patronizing, right? This is just like a horribly, even the Republicans will not like it, imposition upon what you do with your money, what you do with your time, what you do with your life. Bart.
Okay, given that we're already in a state where the right to bear arms is legal, what would you propose would be the best way that these people who are allowed to have guns use these guns?
Well, no, that they do still like train and stuff, right? But we don't think that everyone should be owning a gun. We do think owning a gun should be something you decide to do on your own, and we would still like for stricter gun control. It's just like a restriction of the motion, right? Moreover, Bart tells us that now people won't be scared of guns as if that's a value, right? Like somehow the world is just better off when people aren't scared of guns anymore. And lastly, in terms of rebuttal, he tells us that now everyone will have a proper mindset when on our side of the house, Sadik sit down, they will not have the proper mindset. This is a lie, right? Because oftentimes, even in America, where we all think that these crazy gun-toting Republicans are crazy, the gun culture is actually very productive and it's safe, and they're crazy in other ways, but not here. But if your problem is how they are introduced to guns, then, you know, do the regular thing and make it so that if you want to own a gun, you register it and pass certain psychological tests. We think that is definitely taken care of in status quo. On to my constructive, you encourage risky behavior. First of all, how is it risky? And here I'm going to deal with the other options for self-defense and how it becomes a last resort. Sit down. The premise here is that guns cannot protect past the point of deterrence. That is to say, the moment you pull out that gun, your life is already under threat because now you are in a gunfight. It can only attack at that point, and it can only hope to neutralize whoever you're in a fight with. And the likely context of you pulling out a gun is, first of all, you're likely to be taken by surprise, and you're likely to be panicking. And your first instinct is, I do not want to die. It does not have to be a first resort for you to realize that when it is already a life-threatening situation, and you do not know if that person plans to harm you or not, and it is likely that they will plan to harm you because they know you have a gun and can hurt them, and it is likely that you will just know that they think that, or suspect that they think that you will think that like just cooperating might not be an option anymore, because it really might, sit down, just not be an option anymore. And at that point, where your life is threatened, your reflexes will kick in, your training will kick in, and that is when you pull out your gun. The other problem here is that the assailant is probably a better shot than you because they have the confidence to assault someone within that community where everyone already has and owns and is trained to own a gun. Which means you will likely be at a disadvantage because you will not have the power to pick your fights when your assailant likely will. It is not wanton violence that is the problem, and that's what they're guarding against. It is what the recourse becomes, and at which point you have to get to your last resort. Having to go to your last resort happens significantly earlier on their side. Lastly, how is it encouraged beyond what I've already implied in my arguments, right? From the standpoint of an individual's disposition, the nature of your training is such that when you are under threat, you do not know because you cannot get the information of whether or not you have your other options there, and any reasonable training program will always tell you to value your life first, because it is your safety first, even if it is a last resort. Lastly, we think that from the standpoint of a policymaker, this perception that everyone is already safer makes it harder for them to push for a stronger police force, even if they want to, because the weight of every other consideration, which will be wanting for your tax money, will seem greater in comparison to the fact that this population, who already has guns and doesn't really want more of a police force, doesn't really want more of a police force. We oppose.
House thanks the Speaker. Deputy.
Here, here.
That's right.
The fundamental failure from that side of the house is that they fail to understand our deterrence effect. For our policy to work, we don't really need to get to the point of conflict. We deter the petty criminals at the very beginning, because these petty criminals, with the knowledge that your likely victim may carry a gun, we can deter these petty criminals away. Their failure to engage at that very fundamental issue shows their lack of understanding of this motion. But before my substantive material, further clarification for this motion. In his rebuttal, Nick told us that, people don't really fear. They still have a perfectly quality and normal life without the right to, without a gun. Because if you walk into, say, really dark alleys, if you know that, fear that, he seems to suggest to us that you don't fear about there may be a man carrying a gun with you not carrying a gun. We say that fear is constant in every American's life. There may still be people walking around, but how can he evaluate that there's no fear? We say that fear is obvious in many of the press and advocating for limitation on gun control. But then, because we're still in the status quo, in the context, these policies are not feasible. So we say that we want to create a more equal playing field where we give every individual a gun and for them to protect themselves and also deter them from any possible petty crime. They also say that, we are being patriotic, like people who do not want gun, why are we forcing them to have gun? We say that people who do not want gun, in the status quo, they don't born with a mindset to have, I don't want gun. It's because they are being actively enforced values upon them by the parents or whatever social media. We said that kind of social media is incorrect in the context where everyone has the right to bear arms. We said that kind of value is posing them into a really disadvantaged position where they're really vulnerable to people who possess arms. Yes, Samuel?
So now you're saying that the government should socialize people in the sense that people would think that guns are very nice and very fluffy and very awesome.
No, they again fail to understand when we say that gun is for you to protect yourself and the very last resort, and many of the long training hours and seminars, we say that actually give us the proper understanding. Again, they fail to understand what kind of comparison are we talking about. In the status quo, the exposure we likely get from this, say, from a random YouTuber talking about guns, or from video games talking about, shooting guns is really fun and cool, or even from gangsters or your random friend. But now, under our policy, we have an untrusted government institution talking about training you and exposing you from a really early stage. We say that that is the responsible way of exposing individuals to guns and creating a safer society. So these are some preliminary engagement. I would like to further go on to talk about the deterrence effect, which in next speech he's been talking about. Oh, it won't really be the last resort. It will be like it won't really be the last option. He seems to suggest that we are actually increasing the risk, or the deterrence effect is not really working, because in those moments of dangers, in those moments you will anyway pull out your gun anyway, and you may not really fight yourself away from those criminals. We say that you don't really understand what criminals think. Under the status quo, most criminals assume that their victims do not possess a gun and do not have any ability to protect themselves from these criminals. Don't you agree?
No, we're okay with more crimes happening as long as the crimes that do happen are less lethal.
Ladies and gentlemen, imagine when every individual has a means to say that, I may possess a gun, and you criminal, you cannot do whatever you want simply because you have a gun and I don't. That is the calculus we want to input into this society, where there's no this imbalance of possession of firearms, which they don't realize is happening and ongoing in our American society today. What they have been telling us is that, we will encourage more risky behaviors and more risk-taking behaviors, I assume, because when individuals they possess arms, they may use it in irresponsible ways. But when you listen to the Prime Minister's speech carefully, we see that right to bear arms may be revoked when you have used it in any illegal means. So we see that when every individual, they have this really fundamental right, and if you use it in any risky way, an irresponsible, illegal way, then your right will be very likely taken away from the government institution. We say that is also another deterrence effect working in trying to deter people from actually misusing gunfires. Again, their failure to understand this really fundamental issue is really mind-boggling. We say that in their world, they are encouraging this monopoly of firearms possessed by crime like lawbreakers. And they're also attacking us saying, we are encouraging a weaker police force. Hell no, ladies and gentlemen. We say that we still want a strong police force. We say that all these taxpayers, all these politicians, they won't really change the calculus of saying, we have sufficient gun protection from individuals and then we don't really need to spend that money into police force. We need more analysis for him to make that kind of assertion. But on our side of the house, we do recognize that even from his assertion that we are entering this modern age, there are still areas of America where police cannot reach 24 hours a day. So if police cannot protect you constantly, we need individuals, we need to empower them to actually deter criminals from them. We do recognize that there may be added risk in really open firearms, but we said that kind of open firearms is already a possessing threat in our society, and it's a really imbalanced harm when every individual, many of them, they do not have the means to possess a firearm. Under our policy, we try to bring them onto a more equal playing field, which I don't really understand what is going on in the mindset, as in, they seem to think that for every average Americans, now that they're exposed into this constant threat by many criminals carrying an arm or doing any harm to their family members, they still think that, we have police force, that's enough. We want to further restrict, but they never understand this debate is talking about America, where gun arm is the right to bear arm is really fundamental to every American. But in our status quo, we say that it's a really unequal playing field, whatever by monetary means, whatever by any societal value, and also by very risk-taking, risky exposure. We say that kind of imbalance is harming every American individual. Under our policy, we want to normalize guns into part of every individual's means as the last resort to protect their arms. But their side of the house, they seem to suggest to us that firearm, you should only limit it to criminals and policemen. We said that kind of protection is insufficient at this time in the world. We are very proud to propose. Thank you.
House thanks the Speaker, Deputy Leader.
Ladies and gentlemen, gun is not an extension of rights. Gun represents the power to kill. Ladies and gentlemen, we regret the government's case today that tell us to extend the power to kill and to decentralize the power to kill to everyone in America, if the context is in America. We say the distinctions that it is in America. The distinctions that opposition is making today is that firstly, that policy represents a further decentralization of force, and secondly, that policy is actually imposing a burden on everyone else, the burden to protect themselves, the burden to hold justice for themselves, and the burden of exercising a power to kill when they deem necessary. We think that these implications are very serious. We say that today, shooting is not a simple matter of techniques. Shooting also requires a lot of cognitive skills, a lot of psychological skills, and lots of moral burdens. We think the government side today is simplifying the case in telling us that simply by training the skills, people can be capable of making the choice on when it is the last resort. We do not believe that this is the case. Nick has told you that the right case to do is to slash guns and to increase police funding and increase police trainings and not further decentralization of police. We say that it is even harder for the government to make a case to strengthen the police when people have the idea in their mind that they are ultimately their own protectors, that they are ultimately responsible for making the choice of violence for themselves. We say that we have to have the idea of monopoly of force to go back to the minds of Americans in order for the government to make a case for police to start with later on. So before my extensions, a few ideas that came from the opening government, right? Mainly on how their policy can implement deterrence. We do not see how that's the case. Firstly, because it is precisely the right to bear arms, precisely the easy accessibility of bearing arms that makes criminals so violent in America. But more than that, when you allow everyone to have ready training for arms, you're only making it more easily accessible for everyone to start with. And this will only make people, when they yield to temptations, to easily resort to violence to start with. But secondly, we also say that when they talk about the example of dark alley or dark alleys, we do not really see how it stands for the case, because it is always the criminal that makes the first initiative. If the criminals have the mindset that they know that every American has gun training and that every American possesses guns, what they will do is that they will shoot in advance regardless of the victims' responses. They would know that the victim may be responding with violence. So they will shoot in advance, and given that you are in a dark alley, you will be dead before you even know it. But thirdly, also on changing their mentality. When they're saying that they want to change mentality, what will happen is what Nick has already told you. Firstly, how they characterize the society. Society is filled with fear. So what happens when people are afraid? We say that there are lots of considerations that you have to make when you have to decide whether it is a last resort or not. But when people are filled with fear in their mindset, what they would do is that they would become rashful. This is what Nick has already told you. They ever believe that the characterization of the government side today is actually standing for outside after rebuttals. And secondly, the government side also told that it is okay to tell people, and it is actually valuable for the government to tell people that guns are okay, that we want them to be used to guns since kindergarten. We say, what the heck is this? We do not want people to think that guns is okay. We do not want people to think that the power to kill is okay. When the government side is telling people that gun is not a big deal, we will say that killing become not a big deal for lots of people as well. You will only implement more fear and less deterrence for criminals to start with. Before I go into my extensions closing.
Do you not think that people now have a healthier respect of guns since they have had to live with it all their lives?
No, because firstly, we say that we do not want people to respect guns in the sense that they think that guns is a good equipment to start with. We think gun should always be a last resort, and I will now tell you why guns should not, the last resort of choice should not be decided by people to start with. We say that the idea of monopoly of force comes in this place. We say they should also be always be the monopoly of force, with police being a special agency of force and courts being a special agency of justice. Why is this the case? We say that it is actually very difficult for people to decide whether it is a last resort or not. Firstly, you have to find out that there are no alternatives, and secondly, you also have to consider that your life is under real threat, and thirdly, you also have to consider the case of proportionality. And we said that these cases are very hard to measure because it requires you to firstly judge the incentives and ability of both you and your assaultant. But secondly, you also have to judge the surrounding environment. And thirdly, you are doing all these judgments in tension, like in great tensions, right? Like a lot of these cases require you to have instant responses, which you will see people making their first move, perhaps getting their gun out, or perhaps making a similar taking their gun out move, and you will have to comply in that very second. Because if you do not act first, the idea the government is telling you is that you will be shot in the very first place, because this is the idea of shooting and being shot. No, not now. So you say that for these people, instead of doing that careful judgment, what they will do is that they will yield to fear. They will also yield to lots of unseemly considerations, which will allow them to make a wrong choice. But secondly, that is why we say that we will leave these choices to police, because first they have more training, and second they also have more resources and more manpower. They will ensure them that their lives are not under threat in the very first place, so they can decide whether to capture, whether to shoot them at their hands or legs to make minor injuries, or to have other alternatives before they resort to death last resort. But we say when we give last resort to these people, what they will do is that under fear, under tension, under a requirement to make instant responses, they will make a wrong choice. And what is the impact of a wrong choice? The impact of wrong choice is the dead life. It's a dead human being. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not believe that it is fair for death victims. But we also do not believe that it is fair for the people who shot in the very first place. But secondly, we also say that it is a lot harder, not now, it is a lot harder to regulate these individuals. We say that police are under very harsh regulations, right? They have to handle reports when they shoot, they have to handle reports already when they shoot guns. But for these individuals, they can resort to this easy idea of self-defense, because they think that they see other people attacking them, because they think that other people are making a move. Therefore, they can resort to lawyers, they can resort to different regulations that the government side is proposing right now. And given the mentality that the government is imposing on us, we say that this would be the case. But secondly and lastly, we say that this is also imposing an unfair moral burden on these people. We say that what will happen after these people pull the trigger rationally? What would they know? What would they feel if they find out that these people that they shot are actually innocent? We said they will feel immense regret for both the victim and the family for the rest of their life. But that moral burden does not jump in that particular moment when they should, because at that moment they're under immense fear and immense tensions that they cannot really function that properly and that rationally. But afterwards, they will be thinking over and over again that they have been taking a human life unfairly in the course of their own lives. And we said this is an unfair moral burden that the government is imposing on all individuals in society. We believe that the government and police should be the monopoly of force and therefore should not be decentralized and imposed on individuals. Thank you.
House thanks the Speaker, Member of Government.
Opening government talked about the philosophical aspects of owning guns, how it improves the qualities of life, how it's a right, blah blah blah. Closing government will deal with the practical implications as well of owning guns and how we then register this and all the practical benefits that come along with this. We're talking about, I'll be amalgamating my rebuttals together in my extensions. 4 main issues I'll be talking about. Firstly, how we balance the interests of people and society. Secondly, how we reduce gun violence. Thirdly, how we basically improve enforcement of gun violence, and unlike what they would I think have you believe. Fourthly, how we balance of symmetry of power within a gun war. First and foremost, right, how we balance the interests of the people and society. And this is where we have to argue the things they stand for, simple regulation, things like that, have to be talked about in the context of the American society, right? And the reason why, despite all the gun violence that has been happening over the last few decades, nothing has been done on gun regulation is because the Parliament is stuck in a bloody deadlock. We think then, we have to understand that basically we need to balance the interests of a large majority of people who believe it their fundamental rights to own guns, as well as the safety of society. How then do we do this? We do this by having our motion go through. We allow their interests to be protected because this is something that's so important, and this at least allows something to pass in Parliament. And then we also allow for the protection of these people, because now, unlike in status quo, people now know how to handle the guns. People now know how to protect themselves, as the Republicans always argue. Basically, they stress that we will be unable to push for a stronger police force right now. And we say that's absolute bullshit, right? Because self-defense is always the first thing we resort to. Because the police force, as we would like to say, is something that comes afterwards, right? After the violence has happened. So at that moment, it is up to you to protect yourself. We think that all individuals ought to be able to have this kind of protection and this kind of a right, right? And I'll be talking about later within my third substantive how we'll be how actually our policy improves and empowers the police force and why that point completely and absolutely false. Secondly, how we reduce gun violence, right? And this is where we argue that the kinds of environments we we're introducing with our policy produces exactly the kind of cognitive, psychological, benefits, mindsets that we want the individual to have to even have the maturity to handle guns. Why? Let me just give you a case study and comparison of America and Canada
Before
today.
you do.
No. Canada basically has got even more guns than the US does, but we don't even hear of half the shootings that they do. Why? Because these people have been trained from usually very young ages to learn how to use and handle guns every day in their lives, right? And we basically see a healthy respect for the impact of guns has been honed into them from the beginning. It's no longer in the US where you just have a fear of guns and that's it. You're afraid to touch them, you're afraid to go near them, you're more likely to feel absolutely panicky when you hold one. On the other hand, in Canada, where people are actually trained to handle guns, trained to respect guns, in this event in which they will actually need to handle one, they're not going to be as panicky, they're not going to use the gun as a last resort as they want you to believe. No. We basically see that you're basically a lot calmer in the situation, you're a lot more able to defend yourselves. We reduce gun violence this way. Because people will not use guns as the last resort. People have a respect for guns, aren't just going to use it in random shootings and things like that.
Hold man.
What?
If I rob you blind today, it is because I want money, not because I don't respect guns.
Yeah, but if you rob me blind today, I at least can defend my money, right? And I will be able to defend you because I now have the training to shoot you in non-lethal areas such as your arms or your legs, as you so kindly pointed out. And since it's non-lethal, you're not really injured, my money's not gone, I am not lost, I don't suffer any loss in the process. We think that's a great thing to have. Third point, how we basically improve enforcement on gun violence, right? And this is where we have to argue, this is where basically everything they would like to argue for, like all the regulations we want on guns and things like that, doesn't happen, right? At least it happens in our policy, because obviously when we hand out that handgun to you, you're going to be registered under a license. There's going to be a database perhaps on every single person and what kind of a gun that person owns, how many bullets has this person purchased every single time he wants to purchase his bullets and things like that. We see this kind of regulation can only happen under our policy. And we think this is great for the police, right? Because in the event that gun violence actually happens, there is a reduced time gap now if we want to figure out who shot the bullet, where did this bullet come from, where did the gun come from, right? Things like that. So we are able to crack down on people who use these legal guns, basically, who are given to them. Then we want to talk about the black market of guns, right? And this is where criminal syndicates largely use this because clearly they know that, if they use the guns that the government gave them, they're going to be tracked down really, really easily. Basically, on the idea of black market of guns, this means now the police have got, this is why the police are empowered. Now that we don't have to run around looking for illegal guns or badly registered guns or guns that aren't registered at all within society today, now there's more focused attempts on cracking down on unregulated guns right now. So even in the case when you want to talk about black market of guns still existing within society, it's far easier because we know which guns are the black market ones, which ones are the guns that were actually given to you by the government. We can settle both.
Before
Fourth
6?
point, no. How we balance the symmetry of power within a gun war. Sorry, Nick. Basically, and this is where, basically we argue that the psychological and physical preparation in having a gun is exactly what we need in order to fight a gun war. Because unlike what Nick said, these kinds of panicky people aren't going to exist anymore. Because if you've been trained to handle a gun from a very young age, no. If you've been trained to handle a gun from a very young age, basically we reduce already crimes, things like accidental shootings, right? Because you're not going to fly into a fit the second you touch a gun in order to protect yourself. You're not likely to shoot yourself. You're not likely either to shoot the attacker in a lethal way in the heat of the moment. No, because you've had that training. You're likely to do so. You're unlikely to shoot them in non-lethal ways just in order to be able to protect yourselves. Okay? And then basically, now the pro-gun argument that the Republicans so want actually stands. Because people are actually empowered now to protect themselves. In the status quo, what happens is that they argue that since guns already exist, bad guys have access to guns, therefore good guys ought to have access to guns to protect themselves. But basically, we need to argue that basically what happens now is that the good guys usually purchase their guns and they leave it in the drawer. So when they're actually confronted with a burglar in the house, they don't know what to do with the gun when they actually hold on to that gun. We actually empower those sorts of people. And then they wanted to argue to us about the moral weight that which we we are pushing onto these people because now, they're going to have to live with the fact that maybe they killed someone. We already showed you how they're not probably going to kill people. In fact, they're far less likely to accidentally shoot you and kill you because they are already trained. And we say that even if this is a moral burden which you're basing on you, we see that in the context of these societies where you can't even have gun legislation, you can't even have more enforced gun regulations, this is basically something we're willing to take for the safety and benefit of the whole of society. I am very proud to propose. Okay.
House thanks the Speaker, member of the opposition.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think the proposal suggested by the government side is like engaging more people into violence. As the lower house of the opposition, we're going to prove you why this is fundamentally harmful, because you're actually cultivating the cultures of violence and you're making people have the bad perception about the society as a whole. They will always feel more insecure rather than empowered, rather than feeling more safer. Before that, a few rebuttals. Firstly, it's about the ideas that it's better for us to regulate the black market because we are actually empowering the police force. Ladies and gentlemen, when you have more people have guns on their own hands, and creating deterrence is no longer about how to use a gun. It's about in whose hands that you have a more powerful gun. So it becomes the competition of the skills and also the quality of the gun itself. So in the black market, there are actually more people trying to sell more the gun of the high quality with relatively cheaper prices. We don't see why you are making any differences trying to make an effort to regulate the guns better. Secondly, it's about creating deterrence because you want to reduce the crime commitment. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that as long as the criminals' mindset are not changed fundamentally, they realize that you can't target at these people because they know how to use guns. They will always target at the people who are relatively weaker, like the children, that under the age of 18 or the older people or the women. Then they may think that maybe you are not as skillful as them in terms of using guns. So we think there are still the existence the crime commitment. Yes.
If you think that gun regulations aren't going to work under status quo, then would you prefer banning guns altogether?
No, ladies and gentlemen, we are not banning guns, but we just don't want to engage guns because we don't like this culture. In my extension, there are a few subpoints. Firstly, goes back to the rebuttal towards the argument about this is already the last resort. Ladies and gentlemen, as long as you let people to possess guns in their hands, the threshold of you thinking about using violence to attack others automatically became lower because this is always a slippery slope. So it's very likely to create disproportionality. In 2011, New York Times reported that there's a child who tried to surprise her aunt by climbing through the window of his house, but the father actually saw that, and then because he feels so secure all the time, he thought it's someone trying to invade his sister's house. So he actually used a gun to shoot his own child. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't want to see this tragedy from happening again because every time when you see someone trying to do something which is like a violation of your own house, of your rights and invading your house, you started to use gun without ever considering calling 911 because you think gun claims your ego, gun empower yourself, you don't need a policeman, calling 911 is so inefficient. No, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, you will never think about reporting to the police. For example, if you find your wife is cheating you on, you find him having sex with another guy on the bed. Ladies and gentlemen, you're more likely to just use a gun to shoot others. We think you will not engage in negotiation, the neutral parties to negotiate and trying to reduce conflict in a peaceful way. No, thanks. Secondly, it's actually impossible for you to really protect the weak because you're actually creating a structure which is institutionally discriminatory, because you're imposing bloodshed by simply empowering the people who really know how to use guns. But for those people who, no thanks, for those people, maybe they are not like really at the right age to go to a training school to really possess the skills to use guns, or they are not really skillful even if they are already in the school. Like you are in the same class, but still there's some people are much better at it, some people are less better at it. So we think it's actually not working. Lastly, we think you're actually homogenizing people. Just because something is good doesn't mean that you have the power to impose it. We think crime commitment is a societal failure. When the government fails to prevent crimes at the first place, it means that the government loses some legitimacy, loses some kind of space to control, to tell us, why should I do this? We think just because something is good doesn't mean that there's a legitimate ground for you to impose the idea of bloodshed and violence. Take the example of the Muslims in the European countries. Whenever there's like the media mistakenly portray the Muslim as violent and as terrorists, there are some Muslims that are against this idea, but they want to solve this stereotype, to remove this discrimination in a peaceful way. But simply because these Muslims, they are the minorities, they don't want to use violence. They are actually have to be forced to opt in this culture of engaging violence because they are marginalized. Because the majority of the Muslims there want them to be violent. Even if they go, the purpose is that to remove the stereotype towards Muslims, to stop portraying them as terrorists. But the way is wrong. So we think the outcome is as important as the way you're trying to achieve your goal. We don't want to marginalize the people, because five points that because you're creating the bad perception about society. Starting from 9/11, the security check has been intensified everywhere in the United States. But do you feel safer? No. Because you are always, even if there are all the monitors and cameras and everywhere, the psychology of citizens, you have to look at the psychology of citizens. They realize that in every pocket of every passersby, there's a gun there, and you naturally feel insecure. You will become sleepless, and you have more stereotype, because even if someone's not violent, but you will look at someone and you realize there's a gun in his pocket, you think that you feel insecure and you have more doubts towards each other. That's why you sometimes will end up in disproportionality in terms of self-defense. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the idea that we want to tackle the societal failure, like prevent crime commitment with the governmental power, instead of engaging people to force them to accept the idea, that to force them to be exposed with all the guns, to let them realize that this is the only way we can tackle it. Ladies and gentlemen, the government failed to tackle the crimes commitment, but doesn't mean that the government has the right to shift the obligation from itself towards the citizen. You fail to protect me. Well, why have you to ask me to obligatorily opt into that culture? We're proud to oppose. Thank you.
House thanks the Speaker. Government whip.
Why?
I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I did not think.
Wow.
You gonna cut that too?
Can you close it up?
Sure, sorry.
In American society, it is estimated that every person out of 10 people own a gun. In the reality which we are living in, gun ownership already pervades. You can't expect a person to call 911 when another person or my enemy is already in my house holding a gun towards my son. You can't expect, ladies and gentlemen, for me to treat this as an option of last resort to call 911 when my life is already in danger.
But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think once the state has failed, irrespective, because it is simply unreasonable for us to expect the state to allocate policemen and policewomen across the corners of every single street, because that's simply unreasonable. In that reality, when a vacuum exists and it is virtually impossible for us to eradicate that vacuum, should individuals take up that responsibility to create a collective framework of protection, we think individuals should take up that cause. 3 questions in my speech. Firstly, why a policy of compulsion is justified. Secondly, how a policy will massively reduce gun-related deaths and create more responsible and accountable gun users. And finally, how our policy will incentivize the state to compel gun owners, ladies and gentlemen, to register their guns. They might want to assert that, well, under status quo, we can already compel them. But in the reality which we're living in, among the 50 states, ladies and gentlemen, more than 27 of the states do not compel individuals to register their guns. We think once there are a lot of individuals who have guns, now the state would have some teeth to compel individuals to register their guns, and why those kinds of things are necessarily beneficial. So the first question, why is compulsion justified? The first thing which we heard, ladies and gentlemen, that it is simply unjust to force a person to take another person's life, to protect another person, because at times it can be traumatic. And the extension which we heard is that at times it is unjust to co-opt Muslims to a culture of violence. 2 responses. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, it's not mutually exclusive, because under status quo, gun owners already exist and pervade society. The point here, these individuals at times will already be put into a pressure box to shoot a person in the feet, or at times to take that person's life. The problem here, that person is not mentally prepared because that person hasn't gone through the training process, which is continuous for a very long period of time. Our policy would at least mentally prepare that person, and we think that mental preparation is good. But my second response, even if I genuinely do not want to withdraw my gun and shoot that person, under our policy, at least I know the person next to me, my brother, my neighbor, or random passerby will be able to take up that responsibility and shoot that person instead. Under your policy, if I have the gun and I know that other people out there might not have the gun, therefore I'm forced to use my option, which is to shoot that person, ladies and gentlemen, even if I'm unprepared. So at worst, at least under our policy, a transfer of responsibility towards my neighbors or towards that random passerby will exist. The next thing which we heard in extension is that it is unfair for individuals to force individuals to feel insecure because guns are everywhere. Whether we like it or not, guns are already everywhere, as I pointed out in the preface of my speech. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, under your policy, insecurities will massively increase, because now the perception is it is the enemies who own the gun. Therefore, we think under our policy, once there is an upskilling of individuals who own guns, therefore I'll feel more secure, because I know that if a random attack happens, other people around me would be able to protect me. Under status quo, I do not get that kind of protection, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's something which is really important. So let's answer the next question under this premise. The argument was, now there will be a deficit in police force because now the state assumes that everyone is safer. We think this policy is a complementary measure towards the police force. Why? We think there are massive incentives for the state to upskill the police force. Why? Because once guns are everywhere and people are trained to use guns, ladies and gentlemen, that means the police force must always be vigilant, because they know that people around them own guns, ladies and gentlemen, and the failure for them to upskill means that they will be replaced by people who own guns, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, now there's a direct incentive for the public to pressure the police and the government to upskill. Now I'm forced to have a gun. I'm forced to wear a gun around me because of your failure. Therefore, there will be a massive incentive or push to ensure that police force will upskill. Let's answer the second clash in this debate. How do we reduce gun-related death? The argument and the assertion from this side is that now criminals will preemptively shoot the person because the perception is that everyone owns a gun. Obiting already told us that now criminals will already be deterred because everyone owns a gun. The unique difference of my rebuttal is that now, if I am to shoot you, ladies and gentlemen, because I want to preemptively shoot you, now especially often crimes happen in public, the next person would be there to retaliate and shoot me back. In that particular regard, there's a disincentive for me to shoot you because there's a collective framework of protection which exists in that community. Therefore, even if I shoot you, retaliation will happen. Yes?
How is a passerby going to have the power to judge who is the violator and who is the violated?
It's quite easy. How is so? Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we think in that particular regards, obviously that passerby would not have a direct incentive to automatically shoot you. Some form of discretion should already take place to begin with. But secondly, Under your policy, that happens as well. Because passerbys already own guns to begin with, but the harm is that they are not trained at all, at least under your policy. To continue schooling, I'll be trained when to do so, what to do, what procedures I need to go through. That's comparatively better. But more importantly, Natalie specifically told you how under policy we can reduce accidental shootings. The problem here, the reason why accidental shootings happen is because the psychology, ladies and gentlemen, of these particular prospective victims. They see themselves as individuals who are most vulnerable, often because they're women or they are victims of minority attacks, ladies and gentlemen. The media portray them to be very weak, and often they are mentally unprepared. We think on a policy, through an active schooling process, we can mentally prepare them so that once they're prepared, they will no longer panic and automatically shoot that person. Why is this point really important in this debate? Because the vast majority of gun-related deaths happens out of accidental attacks. Therefore, our extension will nicely fit into this debate, Mr. Speaker, because we reduce the amount of accidental attacks. The next part which we specifically told you is that how our policy will level the asymmetry of power which exists. It is true at times that these criminals will use a surprise tactic. I will outnumber you and all these kinds of things. Under our policy, we can level the influence of these criminals. Primarily, ladies and gentlemen, because we get weekly training. Now we have codified formal training, therefore our level of accuracy will increase. The response time of redrawing my weapon will increase. And it is true at times, if I genuinely know that I'm outnumbered, I cannot win, I'm going against a person who holds an AK-47, that school will train me to handle pressure boxes, ladies and gentlemen. I know when to shoot and when not to shoot. You can't expect a person who's not trained to make that prejudgment. We think our policy will improvise this. But as I explained in my preface, ladies and gentlemen, under our policy, registration would be compelled towards individuals because not everyone owns the gun. We think registrations mean that time gap would be increased, that would be reduced. Therefore, it's easier for us to capture criminals, use it as evidence to capture criminals. All of those will exist. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world in which guns pervade. The problem here, accidental attacks happen, individuals are unprepared, criminals are much better than me, thus putting me at a disadvantage. Our policy will improve all of those. Thank you.
House thanks the Speaker. Opposition whip.
Mr. Speaker, as the last speaker, I'm going to ask 3 questions to summarize the whole debate. Firstly, whether normalizing violent culture is the best way to protect the society. Secondly, whether this proposal can actually deter would-be criminals. And lastly, whether citizens even have legal obligation to be skillful gun users. To the first question, whether normalizing violent culture is the best way to protect the whole society. Now, the deadlock remaining in the opening half debate is the question whether using a gun can remain as a last option, or whether the police system is effective or not. What we bring you from closing opposition in particular is that whether or not this remains as a last resort, the real harm happened on the level of the public perception. Right? We tell you that the real harm is that you normalize the use of violence and perpetuate a violent culture from a societal level. We told you that this is even more harmful when the closing government came up here and claimed that, you know what, police is useless later because the police can only come afterwards, and it is up to the citizens to decide whether or not they want to use violence to protect themselves.
Sir.
We say that's the real harm, because at that point in time you are pushing everyone to opt in the violent culture and say that the state is incapable of preemptively protect you from violence. We think the harm is that the state is perceived as incapable of protecting the citizens and to preventing violence preemptively.
Sir.
We think in that regard, you are perpetuating a violent culture and say that violence is the only way for citizens to protect themselves, whether or not it is the last resort or not.
Sir.
Yes.
Under our policy, that exposure to gun and violence is under accountable government institution, but in the status quo, it's by unaccountable users, random people, random culture, random movies.
First of all, you can really detect the culture or the psyche or the psychology of every potential gun user, right? But secondly, I will tell you why this proposal failed to deter would-be criminals in my second touch. So be patient. So, coming back to this analysis, the second thing we bring you from closing opposition is that you make every citizen be more sensitive to violence, right? The whip speaker coming from government bench came up here and said they want to mentally prepare every citizen for the use of violence. But we told you from closing opposition that more often than not, the case is the opposite, right? We bring you the tragedy of the wrong killing of a father to his son. Because now, in this regard, even though you train every citizen, but when you are facing that kind of danger, you cannot really do that kind of calculation because now you are perceived the society as insecure. That is why you will even have more incentive to use violence and pull the trigger in the wrong way. We don't see this kind of tragedy to happen again when you intensify the sensitivity to violence on a societal level, right? But lastly, we told you from closing opposition that this proposal marginalizes those people who don't want to opt in the cultural, opt in the violent cultures. We told you that citizens have every right to remain non-violent if they really want, and who is the state to impose what it believes is the ideal culture on me, and tell me that a society where everyone owning a gun is the best society for me to survive and live. Closing a government tell you that now everyone can pull the trigger to protect a potential victim. We say that is harmful to those people who are not willing to pull the trigger but are forced to do so under your proposal, because now using violence to protect yourself becomes the mainstream culture and is normalized on the state level and the societal level. We think that's the real harm that will bring you from closing opposition later. Moving on to the second part of this debate, whether this proposal can really deter those would-be criminals. So from the opening government, we heard this idea that when everyone possesses guns, it can deter those would-be criminals. We told you clearly from closing opposition that it's never the case. We told you that when criminals decide to use a gun to commit potential crimes, they don't use a gun out of passion or out of emotion. They use a gun out of calculation. That is why this proposal cannot be effective, because ultimately you cannot remove the intention of the criminals to commit crimes. They are still to commit that crimes out of this intention of hurting other people. That is why under your proposal, the harm is even larger, because now they know everyone is going to possess a gun. That's why they have more incentive to transfer the target of the crimes from those gun possessing citizens to those who are vulnerable. For example, children who only know what a gun is for, according to the model of the opening government. Right? We say this become even more harmful when the power structure become a would-be criminal and a potential victim become even more unbalanced. But from the closing government, we heard this idea of the revenge within community. But Mr. Speaker, we say revenge within community can only be intensified under their model. Why? Because now everyone can own a gun and has gone through those kind of training of using a gun. That is why if they really have the intention of revenge, you make that kind of revenge even more likely. That is why we say in terms of deterring would-be criminals, the effect is effectiveness and even counterproductive, because it encourages revenge and creates more would-be criminals. Yes?
You with our point that any attempts to ban guns or regulate guns doesn't happen under your paradigm.
Here.
That is why from closing opposition, we are telling you that whether or not to use a gun, it should be decided by the citizen. But it is not the state to tell me that it is my legal obligation to use a gun and be a skillful gun user, which is exactly my third issue. Right? Whether or not citizens have legal obligation to be skillful gun users. Now, from the whole entire government bench, we heard this idea that having a gun is the extension of your right to a fundamental survival. We have two levels of responses. Firstly, we say if having a gun is so fundamental is a so fundamental right to your survival, then why under your proposal you remove this kind of right from those people who overuse gun, right? So are you suggesting that simply because those people overusing gun, then they should be removed this kind of fundamental right? They never ever draw the distinction. But on the second level, we tell you that there exist fundamental differences from something being my fundamental right and something being my legal obligation, right? Just because having sex is something fundamental to me doesn't mean the state can force me to have sex with every single woman and even tell me how to have sex or how to have sex in a more qualified way, right? We think that opening up the entire debate fail to recognize these differences. Mr. Speaker, in this debate, we told you that normalizing the violent cultures is not the best way to protect the society. We told you that this proposal is impossible to deter would-be criminals and can only create more would-be criminals. We told you that there exists fundamental difference from something being your fundamental right and being your legal obligation. We are supreme proud to oppose this motion.
Liberate the people to walk out.